Hi everyone, welcome back to Grade 9 Science. We're going to look at ecological succession today. Our learning objectives are going to be these. I want you to know how to describe ecological succession and what it is, what it means. I would like you to be able to identify the difference between primary succession and secondary succession, and I would like you to be able to describe what a climax community is. So that's a keyword, and I'd like you to know how this is related to highly sustainable ecosystems. Okay, so let's get started. Ecological succession is natural change in ecosystem over time. I don't know whether you've ever thought about it, but if you were to look at a meadow and you could speed up time and maybe sit and watch that meadow for 500 years, or let's pretend that we were able to sit out by our schoolyard for 500 years, right outside the window of our classroom. And think about what would happen. Well, you'd start with the grasses, and then if nobody cut them, things would start to grow in, and you'd have small shrubs that you see here growing in, and then you'd have larger shrubs grow in, and then you'd have trees start to grow and cover it, and finally you'd get to large trees with a canopy over top of them, and that would be what's considered a climax community. And that's the process of ecological succession, and it's just a natural change as we go through ecosystems. First one we're going to talk about is primary succession, and very straightforwardly, primary succession occurs when there's no soil to start with. So there are many places in the earth where we start with bare rock. There might have been a landslide, there might have been an earthquake, there might have been a volcano that caused there to be no soil except for rocks and minerals present. And then we end up with organisms coming in called pioneering species, and these are things like lichen and little moss, and what these do is they capture dust and soil particles out of the air that's blown around with the wind, and they begin to form soil. You also have weathering of the rocks, and so the rocks are breaking down. So there's physical weathering caused by ice breakage. When ice freezes, when water freezes, it will break rocks, and chemical weathering, because when you have lichen or moss growing on something, it breaks them down, and you end up having soils slowly starting to form. And pioneering species continue, and you will end up with grasses and small shrubs growing. Your intermediate species is when you start to have trees like birch trees growing in. They usually will invade an area, stabilize the soil even more, and allow other trees to grow in. In our area, once we end up with shade-tolerant organisms such as maple or oak, where the baby trees can grow underneath the shade of the parent trees, you have what's called a climax community. And this kind of a system is very, very sustainable, as it will continue forever with baby trees growing underneath the parent trees. It will just continue to be a forest forever and ever, unless, of course, there's a forest fire, and in which case we start with another process of ecological succession called secondary succession. And we're going to get to that in a minute. Here's a picture of primary succession. It's a pretty perfect one. This is Mount St. Helens. It blew up about 40 years ago. And you can see that when the volcano blew up, it left just a whole lot of rock. Towards the top of the summit, that rock remains. But you can see that there has started to be some primary succession, and lichen and moss has grown onto the rocks, and at this stage we now have some wildflowers also growing. If we look at a situation where we have secondary succession occurs where there is already soil present. So in this case, we might have had primary succession occur up to here, and we had a sustainable ecosystem, but for some reason we had a forest fire come through that burned down the entire sustainable ecosystem, and it was cut down because of the fire. But there's still soil. And so fairly quickly, actually, you can start to have pioneering species come in, and these are grasses that will grow fairly soon, and then you'll have shrubs and perennials growing through your intermediate species, and finally a climax community again, which, just as we mentioned before, is the same. Mature maples and oaks and hickory and beech that have baby trees that can grow underneath the shade of larger trees, and this forest can remain forever, of course, until you loop back and perhaps a fire comes through. And that's the process of secondary succession. And you can see a picture here where obviously we've had a forest fire go through this system, and unfortunately the trees died, but shrubs came in, stabilize the soil, and now you can see that we have baby trees growing here, and they're starting to take back over the system, and the process begins again. In fact, some forests require the process of secondary succession to happen, so a forest fire to come through, because some species of trees will only produce seeds that are able to germinate after a forest fire. So they actually need it to be cleared out. So forest fires are actually a natural part of the system, and secondary succession occurs over and over and over.